August 15th, 1944, Saône River crossings, France, 1420 hours, 31 degrees Celsius, dust clouds trailing every vehicle for 300 meters. Lieutenant Ellen Harmon stood beside a hand-painted plywood sign reading Red Bull Express, no traffic except trucks, and watched the 57th deuce-and-a-half roll past in 12 minutes. Odometer logs showed the convoy system, a one-way loop from Normandy beaches to Patton's spearheads, was now moving 4,000 tons per day, but the planners in Cherbourg had calculated need at 6,000 to sustain the breakout toward Germany. Tire blowouts were killing pace. Each truck carried only 2 spares, and the rubberized canvas wore through after 800 kilometers on broken French roads. Harmon's logistics unit had begun stripping tires from damaged vehicles and vulcanizing patches with blowtorches and mess kit adhesive, an improvisation that bought another 200 kilometers per tire but required 11 minutes per patch. Fuel was a separate crisis. 3.7 million gallons delivered so far, yet Patton's Third Army was draining tanks faster than pumps could fill them. A captured German staff map showed enemy reinforcements massing 80 kilometers east. If the Red Bull couldn't double tonnage in 48 hours, the Allied advance would stall in open country, and the Wehrmacht would have time to harden the Siegfried Line. Harmon tapped her clipboard. She had 2 days to turn 4,000 tons into 6,000 using worn trucks and ration tin ingenuity. The Red Bull Express had begun operations on August 25, 1944, 3 days after the Allied breakout from the Normandy hedgerows. The concept was brutally simple. Establish a dedicated truck route from supply depots near the invasion beaches to forward dumps serving the advancing armies. No civilian traffic. No military traffic except supply trucks. One-way roads marked with Red Bulls painted on signs every few kilometers. Trucks drove north and east loaded with ammunition, fuel, rations, and spare parts. They returned south and west empty, completing a loop that operated continuously, day and night, regardless of weather or enemy action. The system bypassed the French rail network, which had been systematically destroyed by Allied bombing and German sabotage. It ignored ports closer to the front, because those ports remained in German hands or were too damaged to function. The Red Bull was pure logistics reduced to its essential components: vehicles, fuel, drivers, and roads. Harmon had joined the operation on August 30th, assigned to a logistics coordination team responsible for maintaining vehicle readiness along a 100-kilometer stretch of highway between Alençon and Chartres. Her background was civilian transportation management. She'd worked for a trucking company in Ohio before the war, managing dispatch schedules and maintenance rotations for a fleet of 68 vehicles. The Army had commissioned her as a lieutenant in the Transportation Corps and sent her to Europe with instructions to apply civilian efficiency to military logistics. What she found at the Red Bull was organized chaos, thousands of trucks moving through a system that was being improvised in real time, with maintenance procedures borrowed from civilian practice, military doctrine, and pure necessity. The trucks were GMC CCKW 2.5-ton cargo trucks, universally called deuce-and-a-halves. Each vehicle was 7 meters long, 2.2 meters wide, and powered by a 6-cylinder GMC 270 cubic inch gasoline engine, producing 91 horsepower. The cargo bed could carry 2.5 tons on-road or 1.5 tons off-road. Fuel capacity was 150 liters, giving a range of approximately 400 kilometers on highways under ideal conditions. Real-world range was closer to 300 kilometers after accounting for convoy speeds, terrain, and engine wear. Each truck required regular maintenance, oil changes every 1,600 kilometers, tire inspections daily, brake adjustments weekly, and countless minor repairs to address the inevitable breakdowns that occurred when vehicles operated at maximum capacity with minimal rest. The drivers came from every branch of the service, but a disproportionate number were African American soldiers assigned to the Transportation Corps. Racial segregation was official Army policy in 1944, and black soldiers were typically relegated to service and support roles rather than combat positions. The Red Ball became one of the most visible examples of this policy. Approximately 75% of Red Ball drivers were black, operating in segregated units under white officers. The irony wasn't lost on anyone involved. The trucks carrying supplies to liberate Europe were crewed by men who returned to a segregated America, where they faced legal discrimination and social exclusion. But on the Red Ball routes, racial politics took a back seat to operational necessity. Trucks had to roll, supplies had to move, and the color of the driver's skin mattered less than his ability to keep a worn vehicle running on bad roads under dangerous conditions. Harman's maintenance section operated from a field depot established in a former German motor pool outside Alençon. The facility included a covered repair bay with space for 6 trucks, a parts warehouse stocked with components scavenged from disabled vehicles, a tire repair station equipped with vulcanizing equipment liberated from a French garage, and a fuel point capable of filling 12 trucks simultaneously. The section employed 43 soldiers, mechanics, tire technicians, fuelers, and administrative personnel who tracked vehicle status and maintenance schedules. Harman's job was to ensure that trucks kept moving, identify problems before they caused breakdowns, prioritize repairs to minimize downtime, and improvise solutions when standard parts or procedures weren't available. The tire problem was emblematic of the challenges she faced. Each deuce-and-a-half rode on 6 wheels, 2 front, 4 rear in dual configuration. The tires were 7.50-20 pneumatic type, designed for mixed on-road and off-road use. Under normal operating conditions, a tire might last 8,000 kilometers. On the Red Ball, operating continuously on roads damaged by bombing and tank traffic, carrying maximum loads at convoy speeds of 60 kilometers per hour. Tires lasted perhaps 800 kilometers. Simple math revealed the crisis. 4,000 trucks in operation, 6 tires per truck, 24,000 tires in service. If each tire lasted 800 kilometers, and trucks were driving 300 kilometers per day in round-trip loops, then the entire tire inventory needed replacement every 3 days. The supply system could deliver perhaps 5,000 replacement tires per week. The Red Ball needed 21,000 per week just to maintain current operations, let alone expand capacity. The vulcanizing solution was Harman's innovation, borrowed from civilian tire repair practices she'd learned in Ohio. When a tire developed a puncture or sidewall separation, standard military procedure called for replacement, but replacement tires weren't available in sufficient quantities. Vulcanizing offered an alternative. Heat and pressure applied to rubber patches could bond them to damaged tire surfaces, creating repairs that lasted for hundreds of additional kilometers. The process required equipment, vulcanizing presses, rubber compound, heat sources, and skill. Harman's team had acquired presses from French repair shops, often trading cigarettes and coffee for equipment. They'd learned through trial and error how to prepare damaged tire surfaces, apply patches correctly, and achieve bonds that held under load. The first patches failed within 50 kilometers. Later patches, after technique improved, lasted 200 kilometers or more. It wasn't perfect, but it kept trucks rolling. Fuel presented different challenges. The Red Ball consumed approximately 300,000 gallons of gasoline daily, fuel for the trucks themselves, plus the fuel they carried forward to supply combat units. The fuel came from depots near the beaches, pumped from ocean-going tankers into 5-gallon jerry cans or 55-gallon drums, then loaded onto trucks for transport. The jerry can, a German invention the Allied forces had copied and improved, was a robust container that could survive rough handling and stacking. Each can held 5 gallons, weighed 22 kilograms when full, and could be carried by one soldier or stacked in truck beds. A deuce-and-a-half could carry approximately 200 jerry cans, delivering 1,000 gallons per truck. That sounds impressive until you calculate how many trucks it takes to sustain an armored division. Patton's Third Army included 6 divisions with roughly 400 tanks, plus thousands of trucks, jeeps, and other vehicles. A Sherman tank consumed 170 gallons per 100 kilometers. An armored division might drive 50 kilometers in a day of active operations, requiring 34,000 gallons just for the tanks, not counting other vehicles. Sustaining 6 divisions required more than 200,000 gallons daily. The Red Bull had to deliver that fuel while also transporting ammunition, rations, and spare parts. Harmon watched the trucks roll past and did arithmetic in her head. 57 trucks in 12 minutes meant roughly 5 per minute, or 300 per hour if the pace held. Each truck carried an average of 5 tons, 2.5 tons of cargo capacity, often overloaded to 3 or even 4 tons when urgent needs demanded it. 300 trucks per hour, 5 tons each, 1,500 tons per hour. But the Red Bull operated in pulses, not steady streams. Heavy traffic during daylight hours when drivers could see the roads and navigate efficiently. Lighter traffic at night when fatigue and darkness slowed pace. Maintenance stops, refueling delays, accidents and breakdowns all reduced effective throughput. The theoretical capacity, what the system could move under ideal conditions, was impressive. The actual capacity, what it moved in practice, was roughly 2/3 of theoretical. The 4,000-ton daily average represented actual capacity averaged over a week. Some days exceeded 5,000 tons. Others fell below 3,000 when weather or enemy action disrupted operations. Harmon's task was to raise the floor, make the bad days less bad and raise the ceiling, make the good days better. That meant reducing breakdowns through preventive maintenance, streamlining refueling to minimize stop time, optimizing convoy spacing to maximize road capacity without causing congestion, and solving 1,000 small problems that collectively determined whether the system succeeded or failed. At 14:45, a truck pulled into the maintenance depot with a blown tire on the right rear axle. The driver was a corporal named Marcus Webb, a former bus driver from Detroit who'd been operating on the Red Bull since it opened. Webb climbed down from the cab and walked over to Harmon. Tire let go about 10 clicks back. Felt it happen, big bang. Then the whole rear end started pulling right. I got us stopped before the rim dug into the road. He gestured at the damaged tire, rubber shredded and hanging in strips from the wheel. That's the 3rd one this week. We're running them too hard. Harmon inspected the damage. The tire had failed catastrophically, not a simple puncture but a complete structural collapse. The rubber had separated from the steel belting, and the sidewalls had torn apart. This tire was beyond repair. She checked the truck's maintenance log, a grease-stained notebook kept in the cab. Webb had logged oil level checks, fuel consumption, and tire pressure readings religiously. The blown tire had been noted as low pressure 3 days earlier, reinflated and marked for monitoring. Harmon made a note. Tire pressure checks needed to happen twice daily instead of once. Low pressure increased heat buildup, which accelerated rubber degradation. Catching problems earlier might prevent catastrophic failures. A mechanic rolled a replacement tire from the parts warehouse and began the swap. The process took 22 minutes. Jack the truck, remove the destroyed tire, mount the replacement, torque the lug nuts, lower the truck, check pressure. Webb used the time to eat a ration and drink water from his canteen. He looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes, dust caked on his face, hands trembling slightly from vibration fatigue. Harmon asked when he'd last had a full rest day. Webb shrugged. Maybe 5 days ago. They needed drivers, so I stayed on the rotation. I'm fine. He wasn't fine. Fatigue was another invisible constraint on the Red Bull's capacity. Drivers worked 18-hour shifts routinely, sometimes longer when operational demands spiked. They drove loaded north, returned empty south, refueled, loaded again, and repeated the cycle. Sleep came in snatches between runs. 4 hours here, 2 hours there, never enough to fully recover. Fatigue degraded performance, slower reaction times, impaired judgment, increased accident risk. Harmon had seen the statistics. Accident rates on the Red Bull were 3 times higher than for normal military transport operations. Most accidents were minor: fender benders, trucks sliding off roads, collisions during convoy maneuvers. But some were serious. 2 drivers had been killed the previous week when their truck missed a curve and rolled into a drainage ditch. Investigations suggested driver fatigue as a contributing factor. The mechanic finished the tire swap, and Webb climbed back into his cab. Harmon handed him a note, authorizing a 6-hour rest period at the next depot. Webb looked at the note, then at Harmon. "Mom, I appreciate it, but they're going to tell me to keep driving. They always do." Harmon shook her head. "Show them the note. It's a maintenance order. The truck needs rest even if you don't think you do." Webb nodded, unconvinced, and drove off. Harmon returned to her desk, a folding table under a canvas awning, and reviewed the day's status reports. 43 trucks had passed through her section since midnight. 7 required tire repairs or replacements. 3 needed oil changes. 1 had a failing water pump and was deadlined pending parts delivery. Deadlined meant removed from service until repairs could be completed. Every deadlined truck represented lost capacity. The Red Bull maintained a fleet of approximately 5,000 vehicles total, but only 4,000 were operational at any given time. The other 1,000 were deadlined for maintenance, awaiting parts, or in transit to repair facilities. The ratio of operational to deadlined vehicles determined system capacity. If the operational percentage fell below 75%, the Red Bull couldn't sustain minimum tonnage requirements. Harmon's job was to keep her section's operational rate above 85%. At 1600, a convoy of 12 trucks arrived simultaneously, a scheduled maintenance stop. The trucks belonged to the 3826th Quartermaster Truck Company, a unit Harmon knew well. The company commander, Captain Gerald Thompson, walked over while his drivers dismounted and began refueling. Thompson was a white officer from Virginia, mid-30s, career Army with a logistics background. He and Harmon had worked together for 2 weeks, developing an efficient routine for company-level maintenance. Thompson's trucks received inspections every 3rd trip through Harmon's depot, a compromise between thoroughness and operational tempo. Thompson handed Harmon his company status report. "We've got 16 trucks operational, 4 deadlined, 1 threw a rod yesterday, complete engine failure. Another has transmission problems, won't shift into 4th gear. 2 are waiting on brake shoes." He paused. "I need those 2 back by tomorrow if possible. We're already short and they're pushing us to increase load weight." Harmon checked her parts inventory. Brake shoes were available. She had 30 sets in stock. Replacing them took a skilled mechanic about 90 minutes per truck. She assigned 2 mechanics to the job and told Thompson to expect his trucks back by 2200 hours. The thrown rod was a harder problem. Engine replacement required hoisting equipment, several mechanics, and 4 to 6 hours of labor. More importantly, it required an engine. Harmon had 3 spare engines in her warehouse, but they were allocated for emergency repairs on trucks that couldn't be towed to depot-level facilities. Using 1 for Thompson's truck meant reducing her reserve. She made the call, deadline the truck, and send it back to Cherbourg for depot maintenance. Thompson wasn't happy. That reduced his company strength from 17 to 16 operational trucks, but he understood the calculus. The brake repairs proceeded smoothly. By 1830, the first truck was ready. By 2100, both trucks were back in service. Thompson's company departed at 2130, refueled and resupplied, heading north to pick up their next load. Harmon watched them go and updated her status board. 2 trucks returned to service, 1 sent to depot, net loss of 1 truck from her section's supported fleet. She'd started the day supporting 231 operational trucks across the units transiting her section. She'd end it supporting 230. Progress backward. At 2200, a staff car arrived from 8th Corps Logistics Headquarters. The passenger was a major named Robert Kessler, the officer responsible for coordinating Red Ball operations across the entire network. Kessler was exhausted and irritable. He'd been working for 3 weeks straight, moving from depot to depot, solving problems and pushing units to increase throughput. He sat down at Harmon's table and asked for coffee. Harmon poured him a cup from a pot that had been sitting on a field stove since morning. Kessler drank it without comment. "We need 6,000 tons per day by August 17th, Kessler said without preamble. Current average is 4,000. That's a 50% increase in 48 hours. Hire says it's not negotiable. Patton's advance depends on it. If we can't deliver, Third Army stops, and the Germans get time to reinforce. How do we make it happen?" Harmon had been thinking about this question for days. The answer wasn't simple. "We have 3 bottlenecks," she said. "Trucks, tires, and drivers. We can't add trucks, we're already operating everything available. We can increase truck utilization by reducing maintenance downtime, but that's a marginal improvement. Maybe 10%. We can reduce tire failures through better inspection and vulcanizing, but that's already being done. The real constraint is drivers. They're working 18-hour days and they're exhausted. We're losing capacity to accidents and slowdowns caused by fatigue." Kessler nodded. "I've heard the same thing from every depot. The solution is to work them harder, push the shifts to 20 hours, reduce rest stops, accept higher accident rates as the cost of meeting tonnage requirements." Harmon shook her head. "That's short-term thinking. Accidents deadlined trucks. Deadlined trucks reduce capacity. You might gain 10% throughput for 2 days before accident rates spike and wipe out the gain. Better solution? Reduce deadline trucks by improving preventive maintenance and rotate drivers more aggressively to manage fatigue. That gives you a 5% increase sustainably." 5% isn't 50%, Kessler said. "No," Harmon agreed, "but 50% isn't possible with current resources. The math doesn't work. We'd need another 1,000 trucks and 2,000 drivers. We don't have them. What we can do is optimize what we have. Run trucks longer between maintenance by fixing problems before they cause breakdowns, reduce turnaround time at loading and unloading points, and streamline refueling. Combined, those measures might get us to 5,000 tons per day. That's a 25% increase. It's not 6,000, but it's achievable." Kessler stared at his coffee. 5,000 won't satisfy Patton. He needs 6,000. Then he needs to slow his advance or accept reduced ammunition expenditure, Harmon said bluntly. "Logistics doesn't bend to wishes. There's a physical limit to how much tonnage this system can move, and we're approaching it. Pushing past the limit breaks the system." Kessler stood up. "I'll report your assessment to Corps. They won't like it, but maybe it'll adjust expectations." He paused at the entrance to the awning. "For what it's worth, I think you're right. But right doesn't always win arguments with generals." After Kessler left, Harmon walked through the depot, checking on the night shift. Mechanics worked under floodlights powered by a portable generator, replacing brake drums on a truck with worn linings. Tire technicians operated the vulcanizing press, repairing punctures on tires pulled from the day's failures. The fuel point was quiet. No trucks scheduled until 0400. Harmon found the night supervisor, a sergeant named Luis Ortiz, and reviewed the overnight maintenance schedule. 8 trucks expected, 2 requiring major repairs, 6 needing inspections and minor fixes. Ortiz had it under control. Harmon returned to her tent and lay down on a cot without removing her boots. Sleep came quickly but lightly. She woke at 0530 to the sound of truck engines and was back at her table by 0600 drinking fresh coffee and reading the overnight status reports. 7 trucks had passed through, 1 fewer than expected. The missing truck had broken down 30 kilometers north and been towed to another depot. The two major repairs were complete. Net result, her section supported 232 operational trucks, up 2 from yesterday. Small gains. At 0730, a messenger arrived with new orders from Corps. The Red Ball was being expanded. Additional truck companies were being diverted from other assignments and added to the operation. The target remained 6,000 tons per day, but the timeline had been extended to August 20th. That gave Harman 5 more days instead of 2. It also meant more trucks transiting her section, perhaps 300 operational instead of 230. More trucks meant more maintenance demand. She'd need additional mechanics, more parts, and expanded facilities. The orders included authorization to requisition resources from nearby units, but requisition authority didn't conjure trained mechanics out of thin air. Harman spent the morning touring other depots along her section of the route, personally assessing their capacity and identifying soldiers with maintenance skills who could be temporarily reassigned. She found 3 mechanics at a field hospital who had civilian experience with truck repair. She found 2 tire technicians in an engineer battalion. She requisitioned a second vulcanizing press from a French garage in Chartres, paying in cigarettes and promising future assistance with parts. By 1400, her section had grown from 43 soldiers to 51, and she'd expanded the repair capacity to handle 10 trucks simultaneously instead of 6. The tonnage began climbing. On August 16th, the Red Ball moved 4,800 tons. On August 17th, 5,200. On August 18th, 5,700. Each increase represented hundreds of small improvements, faster tire changes, more efficient refueling, better convoy spacing, reduced breakdown rates. Harman's section processed an average of 320 trucks per day during that period, up from 230. The operational rate held at 86% despite the increased tempo. Accident rates spiked briefly, then stabilized as drivers adjusted to the pace. Fatigue remained a problem, but Corps instituted mandatory 6-hour rest periods every 48 hours, which helped marginally. On August 19th, the Red Bull delivered 6,100 tons, exceeding the target for the first time. Corps sent a congratulatory message to all participating units. Kessler visited Harman's depot again, this time with a bottle of wine liberated from a German officer's quarters. They drank it from canteen cups while watching trucks roll past in the evening light. "You were right about optimization," Kessler admitted. "We couldn't get to 6,000 by pushing harder. We got there by working smarter. Preventive maintenance, better scheduling, incremental improvements. It's not dramatic, but it works." Harman refilled her cup. "It works until something breaks. We're operating at maximum sustainable capacity right now. Any major disruption, bad weather, enemy action, parts shortage, and we'll fall below 6,000. This isn't a system with much reserve." "Patton's happy," Kessler said. "Third Army reached the Moselle River 2 days ago. They're pausing to consolidate, but the advance hasn't stalled. That's because of the Red Ball, because of you and 1,000 others who kept the trucks rolling." The Red Ball operated at maximum capacity for another 3 weeks. On September 7th, the system began winding down as Allied forces captured ports closer to the front and rail lines were repaired sufficiently to carry freight. Truck convoys continued operating, but the dedicated routes and massive tonnage requirements gradually diminished. By mid-September, the Red Ball had been largely superseded by conventional supply methods. In 81 days of operation, the system had delivered over 400,000 tons of supplies, ammunition, fuel, rations, medical equipment, spare parts, and everything else required to sustain an army in rapid advance. The operation had employed 5,900 vehicles, driven by approximately 23,000 soldiers, operating over a network of routes totaling more than 2,000 kilometers. The cost was measurable. 140 trucks were destroyed in accidents or enemy action. Approximately 800 sustained major damage requiring depot-level repair. Tire consumption exceeded 120,000 units, an average of 4 tire replacements per truck over the operation's duration. Fuel consumption for the trucks themselves, not counting the fuel they transported, totaled 3 million gallons. Soldier casualties included 32 killed and more than 300 injured in vehicle accidents, enemy attacks, and operational mishaps. The human cost of moving supplies rarely appeared in strategic assessments, but it was real. Harmon's section processed more than 7,000 trucks during the Red Bull's operation. They performed 1,600 tire repairs, conducted 900 oil changes, replaced 275 tires beyond repair, and executed dozens of major repairs on engines, transmissions, and braking systems. The section maintained an operational rate averaging 84% across the entire period, higher than the Red Bull's network average of 78%. Harmon attributed the performance to preventive maintenance, skilled mechanics, and a logistics philosophy that prioritized long-term sustainability over short-term gains. After the Red Bull shut down, Harmon was reassigned to a logistics planning staff responsible for developing improved supply procedures for the continuing advance into Germany. She brought with her lessons learned from the Red Bull experience, the importance of preventive maintenance in high-tempo operations, the limits of human endurance and the need to manage fatigue systematically, the value of improvisation when standard procedures or resources were inadequate, and the understanding that logistics capacity was a physical constraint that couldn't be wished away or overcome through willpower alone. These lessons influenced Army logistics doctrine for decades. The Transportation Corps adopted formalized maintenance schedules based partly on Red Bull data. Driver rest requirements were codified into regulations. Tire vulcanizing became a standard field repair procedure. The operational planning assumption that trucks could operate indefinitely at maximum capacity was revised to account for maintenance downtime and sustainability limits. The Red Bull also highlighted racial dynamics within the military. The operation had relied heavily on black soldiers, who comprised 3/4 of the driver force despite representing less than 10% of Army personnel in the European theatre. These soldiers had performed exceptionally under difficult conditions, operating complex vehicles on dangerous roads with minimal rest and inadequate recognition. Yet they returned to a segregated force structure where their contributions were often overlooked or minimized in official accounts. The contradiction between fighting a war for freedom while enforcing racial segregation wasn't lost on participants or observers. The experience contributed to growing pressure for military desegregation, which would be implemented 4 years later by executive order. Harmon personally confronted racial issues throughout her time on the Red Bull. As a white officer commanding integrated maintenance sections, or more accurately, sections that became functionally integrated when operational necessity overrode segregation policies, she saw firsthand the absurdity of racial discrimination. Some of her best mechanics were black soldiers who'd been denied opportunities for advancement because of their race. Some of her most reliable drivers were black men who'd received minimal training because segregated units were considered secondary priorities. She wrote reports documenting performance and recommending recognition, knowing most recommendations would be ignored or downgraded because the soldiers were black. The experience radicalized her politics. After the war, she became an advocate for civil rights and used her platform as a former officer to speak about racial injustice in the military. The technical challenges of the Red Bull also produced innovations that outlasted the operation itself. Tire vulcanizing in field conditions became standard practice throughout the Army. The procedures Harmon's team developed were documented and distributed as technical bulletins. Convoy management techniques refined on the Red Bull routes, spacing protocols, communication procedures, refueling efficiency measures were incorporated into training manuals. The maintenance tracking system Harmon implemented, using simple logbooks and status boards to monitor vehicle readiness, became a model for other logistics units. These weren't revolutionary changes, but they represented the accumulation of practical knowledge gained through operational experience. The strategic impact of the Red Ball was harder to quantify, but undoubtedly significant. Third Army's advance across France in August and September 1944 covered nearly 700 kilometers in 6 weeks, capturing territory, destroying German units, and forcing the Wehrmacht into defensive positions along the German border. That advance was enabled by logistics, by the ability to move supplies forward as fast as combat units moved. Without the Red Ball, Third Army would have outrun its supply lines and been forced to halt, giving German forces time to regroup and establish stronger defensive positions. The Red Ball didn't win battles directly, but it created the conditions that made victories possible. Historians later debated whether the Red Ball represented good logistics or desperate improvisation. The answer was probably both. The system was created because the Allied advance moved faster than anticipated, capturing territory before infrastructure could be repaired or organized. Rail lines were destroyed, ports were damaged. The only option was trucks, so trucks became the solution. The Red Ball was never intended to be permanent or optimal. It was a stopgap measure that worked well enough to sustain operations until better alternatives became available. But within those constraints, it functioned effectively because soldiers like Harman identified problems, developed solutions, and implemented them without waiting for perfect conditions or ideal resources. One particular problem Harman solved illustrated this approach. In early September, a shortage of jerry cans threatened to constrain fuel delivery. Jerry cans were being lost or damaged faster than they could be replaced, left behind at forward dumps, used for purposes other than fuel transport, or destroyed in accidents. Without sufficient cans, fuel delivery capacity fell even when trucks were available. Harman's solution was to establish can recovery teams, small units whose sole job was to travel to forward dumps, collect empty cans, return them to rear depots, and repeat the cycle. The teams used jeeps and trailers, carrying 200 cans per trip. It wasn't glamorous work, but it closed the loop and kept cans circulating through the system. Within 2 weeks, can availability improved by 30%, and fuel delivery capacity increased accordingly. The solution didn't require new resources, just reorganization and a focus on the constraint. Harman's approach to logistics was fundamentally pragmatic. She understood that perfect solutions rarely existed in operational environments. Resources were limited, conditions were difficult, and unexpected problems arose constantly. Success came from working within constraints, identifying the highest impact interventions, and implementing them quickly even when they were imperfect. She also understood that logistics was fundamentally about people, drivers who needed rest, mechanics who needed tools, commanders who needed honest assessments of what was possible. Technical problems had technical solutions, but human factors determined whether those solutions would be implemented effectively. After the war, Harman remained in the Army Reserve and pursued a civilian career in supply chain management. She worked for several major corporations, applying military logistics principles to commercial operations. She also taught as an adjunct professor at a business school, using the Red Ball as a case study in operational logistics. Her lectures emphasized several themes: the importance of understanding system constraints, the need for preventive maintenance rather than reactive repair, the value of empowering frontline personnel to identify and solve problems, and the recognition that human factors, fatigue, morale, training, were as important as technical factors in determining organizational performance. Students often asked about the most important lesson from the Red Ball. Harman's answer varied depending on context, but a consistent theme emerged. Logistics determined operational tempo. Armies could move only as fast as their supplies allowed. Brilliant strategies failed if the supplies didn't arrive. Overwhelming firepower was useless if the ammunition ran out. Victory went to the side that could sustain operations longer, and sustainability was a logistics function. The Red Ball demonstrated this principle at scale. 400,000 tons delivered over 81 days enabled an advance that changed the strategic balance in Western Europe. That tonnage represented millions of individual actions: drivers steering trucks, mechanics fixing engines, planners scheduling convoys, and officers making decisions about priorities and resource allocation. The system worked because all those actions aligned toward a common objective. The Red Bull also demonstrated the limits of logistics. Even at maximum capacity, the system delivered less than Patton wanted. Third Army's advance slowed in September, not because of enemy resistance but because supplies couldn't keep pace with operational tempo. Tanks ran short of fuel. Artillery rationed shells. The logistical constraint became the binding limitation on what was militarily possible. This reality frustrated commanders who believed that aggressive action could overcome material limitations, but it was inescapable. Modern warfare consumed resources at rates that constantly threatened to exceed supply capacity. Managing that tension between operational ambition and logistical reality was a central challenge of 20th century military operations. Harman witnessed this tension repeatedly during her Red Bull service. Commanders wanted more trucks, more fuel, more tonnage. Logistics officers explained what was possible given available resources. The commanders often dismissed those explanations as defeatism or lack of imagination, but the math was unforgiving. A truck could carry only so much weight. A driver could work only so many hours before fatigue degraded performance. Tires lasted only so many kilometers before failure. These weren't negotiable constraints. They were physical realities. Ignoring them didn't make them disappear. It just caused system failures that ultimately reduced capacity below even conservative estimates. One particular confrontation illustrated this dynamic. In late August, a division commander demanded priority routing for his supply trucks, arguing that his unit's position at the tip of the advance justified preferential treatment. Harman explained that priority routing would disrupt convoy spacing and reduce overall system throughput, helping one unit at the expense of others. The commander insisted his needs were more important. Harman stood her ground, citing tonnage data and convoy management principles. The commander appealed to higher authority. Core logistics staff supported Harman's position and the commander's request was denied. The incident reinforced an important principle. Logistics systems functioned optimally when managed systematically, rather than disrupted by individual demands for special treatment. The Red Bull's operational procedures evolved continuously throughout its 81-day run. Early convoys operated with minimal coordination, causing congestion at loading points and inefficient use of road capacity. Later convoys followed detailed schedules that specified departure times, route assignments, and refueling stops. Early maintenance practices were reactive, fixing breakdowns as they occurred. Later practices emphasized preventive inspection and repair, reducing breakdown rates. Early driver assignments rotated randomly based on availability. Later assignments considered driver experience and fatigue levels, matching skilled drivers with difficult routes and providing rest periods based on accumulated duty hours. These improvements came from organizational learning, identifying what worked, documenting procedures, and training personnel. Harman contributed to this learning process through detailed record keeping. She maintained logs tracking every truck that passed through her section, vehicle identification, mileage, maintenance performed, parts used, time required for repairs, and driver information. The data revealed patterns. Certain truck models had higher failure rates for specific components. Particular routes caused more tire damage, and specific times of day saw increased accident rates. Armed with these insights, she could anticipate problems and implement preventive measures. Trucks with problematic components received extra scrutiny during inspections. Routes with high tire damage rates had pressure checks increased. Convoys scheduled during high accident time periods received additional supervision. This data-driven approach was unusual for 1944 military operations, which typically relied more on experience and judgment than systematic analysis. Harman's civilian background in transportation management influenced her methods. She'd learned in the private sector that efficiency came from measurement and continuous improvement. She adapted those principles to military logistics, demonstrating that civilian management techniques could enhance military operations. The Army's institutional resistance to adopting civilian methods gradually eroded as evidence accumulated, showing that data-driven logistics produced better outcomes than traditional approaches. The physical toll of Red Ball operations affected everyone involved. Drivers suffered vibration fatigue, hearing loss from engine noise, and musculoskeletal injuries from long hours handling heavy vehicles on rough roads. Mechanics developed repetitive stress injuries from constant wrench work and experienced burns, cuts, and crush injuries from working with heavy equipment under time pressure. Logistics officers like Harmon worked 18-hour days managing operations, sacrificing sleep and health to keep the system functioning. The cumulative stress wore people down. By the time the Red Ball shut down in September, most participants were exhausted and several were medically evacuated for conditions related to overwork. Harmon herself experienced stress-related health problems. She developed chronic headaches from sleep deprivation and tension. Her hands developed tremors from fatigue. She lost weight because she frequently skipped meals while focused on operational problems. A medical examination in October showed elevated blood pressure and recommended rest. She took 2 weeks of leave, then returned to duty with the logistics planning staff. The health effects persisted for months, gradually improving as operational tempo decreased and she could maintain more regular sleep and eating schedules. The experience taught her that human endurance had limits that couldn't be exceeded indefinitely, even with motivation and dedication. This lesson informed her post-war advocacy for better working conditions in logistics operations. She argued that organizations achieved better performance by maintaining personnel health than by driving people to exhaustion. Rest wasn't weakness, it was a necessary component of sustained high performance. These arguments met resistance in military culture, which often valorized endurance and dismissed concerns about overwork as softness. But Harmon persisted, and gradually the Army incorporated rest requirements and workload limits into logistics doctrine. The Red Ball's legacy extended beyond doctrine and procedures into institutional memory and cultural mythology. The operation became legendary within the Transportation Corps, a symbol of what could be accomplished under difficult conditions through determination and ingenuity. Veterans of the Red Ball carried pride in their service, understanding they'd participated in something significant. The system had moved an army across France, enabled a strategic advance, and demonstrated that logistics could keep pace with operational tempo when properly organized and executed. But the mythology sometimes obscured the reality. Popular accounts emphasized heroism and determination, while downplaying the accidents, exhaustion, and system failures that also characterized the operation. Harmon tried to correct these narratives in her post-war writing and speaking, insisting that honesty about challenges and limitations made the accomplishment more meaningful, not less. The Red Ball succeeded, not because it was perfect, but because imperfect people working with inadequate resources managed to achieve something extraordinary through competence, adaptability, and relentless problem-solving. In 1983, Harmon participated in a symposium on World War II logistics at the Army War College. She was 72 years old, retired from both military and civilian careers, and recognized as an authority on operational logistics. During her presentation, she displayed photographs from the Red Ball dusty trucks, exhausted drivers, makeshift repair facilities, hand-painted signs. She told stories about tire vulcanizing, fuel can recovery, and the mathematics of tonnage delivery. But what she emphasized most was the people. The drivers who kept trucks moving despite fatigue, the mechanics who improvised solutions with inadequate tools, the planners who made 1,000-vehicle convoys function despite countless complications. The Red Ball worked, she argued, because those people refused to accept failure as an option. One attendee asked whether the Red Ball would be possible with modern logistics systems and technology. Harmon considered the question. The technology is better now, computers, better vehicles, GPS navigation, but the fundamental challenges remain: moving supplies from point A to point B efficiently, maintaining vehicles under operational stress, managing human fatigue, coordinating complex operations. Technology helps, but it doesn't eliminate the need for competent personnel making good decisions under pressure. That was true in 1944, and it's true now. Harman died in 1994, 50 years after the Red Ball's operations. Her papers were donated to the Army Heritage and Education Center, where they joined collections documenting other aspects of World War II logistics. Researchers studying those papers found detailed maintenance logs, convoy schedules, parts inventories, and correspondence documenting the daily reality of keeping trucks rolling during the breakout from Normandy. The documents revealed an operation that was simultaneously impressive and fragile, capable of moving 6,000 tons per day, but constantly threatened by tire failures, driver fatigue, and parts shortages. The Red Ball's success came from managing those threats competently, not from eliminating them entirely. The operation's racial dynamics also received increased scholarly attention in later decades. Historians documented that black soldiers performed the majority of Red Ball driving and much of the maintenance work, operating under segregated conditions that denied them recognition and advancement opportunities available to white soldiers. These soldiers' contributions were essential to Allied victory in Western Europe, yet many returned home to face continued discrimination and limited economic prospects. The contradiction highlighted broader injustices in American society and contributed to the civil rights movement's momentum in the post-war period. Harman's role in the Red Ball was modest in scope but significant in impact. She managed a single maintenance section supporting a fraction of the total vehicle fleet. But her section's performance, maintaining operational rates above network average through preventive maintenance and continuous improvement, represented exactly the kind of competence that made the system work. Multiply her contribution by hundreds of similar contributions from logistics personnel across the network, and the result was 400,000 tons delivered over 81 days. The Red Ball succeeded because many people performed difficult jobs competently under challenging conditions. Harman was one of those people, and her story illuminated how large operations depended on countless small decisions executed well. The fundamental lesson of the Red Ball remained relevant. Decades after the operation ended, logistics determined what was operationally possible. Armies moved at the speed of their supply chains. No amount of tactical brilliance or strategic vision could overcome logistical constraints. Victory required not just defeating enemy forces but sustaining operations longer than the enemy could sustain theirs. The Red Ball demonstrated this principle at operational scale, moving supplies fast enough to enable Third Army's advance while German logistics collapsed under Allied interdiction and resource exhaustion. The Allies didn't just outfight the Germans, they outsupplied them, and that made all the difference. The daily rhythm of Red Ball operations followed predictable patterns that masked extraordinary complexity. Morning convoys assembled at depot areas near the Normandy beaches where trucks queued at loading points to receive cargo. Each truck was assigned a manifest specifying contents, weight, and destination. Manifests were critical for tracking supplies and ensuring deliveries matched requirements. A truck carrying ammunition needed to reach ammunition dumps. A truck carrying fuel needed to reach fuel points. Mixed loads complicated distribution, so planners tried to standardize each truck's cargo when possible. Ammunition trucks, fuel trucks, ration trucks. Specialization simplified logistics at receiving points. Loading procedures varied by cargo type. Ammunition came in wooden crates or metal containers stacked and secured with rope or chains. 5-gallon jerry cans of fuel were loaded individually, arranged in rows to maximize capacity while maintaining stability. Rations in cardboard boxes required careful stacking to prevent crushing. Medical supplies in crates marked with red crosses received priority handling. Each truck could theoretically carry 5,000 pounds, but real-world capacity depended on cargo density and stacking efficiency. Ammunition was dense and heavy. A truck could reach weight limits before filling available space. Rations were lighter but bulkier. A truck might fill its bed before reaching maximum weight. Skilled loaders understood these trade-offs and organized loads to optimize both weight and volume. Drivers received route instructions and expected arrival times during morning briefings. The routes changed periodically as front lines moved and road conditions shifted. Some routes followed major highways that tanks and artillery had already chewed up. Others used secondary roads that wound through small French towns where narrow streets and tight turns challenged drivers handling oversized vehicles. Navigation relied on maps, road signs marked with red balls, and occasionally on asking locals for directions when routes became unclear. Radio communication existed but was limited. Most trucks lacked radios, and those that had them used frequencies reserved for emergency traffic. Drivers navigated independently, following convoy leaders and using landmarks to stay oriented. Convoy discipline was essential but difficult to maintain. Trucks were supposed to maintain 50-meter spacing to prevent congestion and allow maneuvering room if a vehicle broke down or encountered obstacles. In practice, spacing varied wildly. Some drivers followed too closely, creating accordion effects where minor slowdowns propagated backward through the convoy, causing stops and starts that wasted fuel and time. Other drivers lagged too far behind, losing visual contact with the truck ahead and sometimes taking wrong turns. Convoy commanders, typically sergeants riding in lead vehicles, monitored spacing and used hand signals or occasional radio calls to adjust formation. But controlling 20 or 30 independent trucks over hundreds of kilometers was more art than science. Weather affected operations significantly. Rain turned unpaved sections of road into mud traps where trucks bogged down and required towing. Heat caused engines to overheat, particularly when climbing grades in low gears. Dust from dry roads choked air filters and infiltrated every mechanical system, accelerating wear. Wind buffeted high-profile cargo trucks, requiring drivers to compensate constantly to maintain lane position. Fog reduced visibility and forced slower speeds. Weather couldn't be controlled, only endured, but it added unpredictability to schedules that were already tight. Mechanical failures were inevitable given the operating conditions. A typical day saw dozens of breakdowns, blown tires, overheated engines, failed starters, broken fan belts, leaking fuel lines, and countless other malfunctions. Some failures were minor and could be repaired roadside. A driver might carry spare fan belts and replace a broken one in 15 minutes. Others required assistance. A blown tire might be changed roadside if the driver had spares, or the truck might limp to the nearest depot if it could move on the rim without causing further damage. Major failures, thrown rods, transmission failures, broken axles, deadlined trucks until they could be towed to repair facilities. The recovery system for deadlined trucks involved dedicated wrecker vehicles that patrolled routes looking for disabled trucks or responding to calls for assistance. Wreckers were heavy-duty trucks equipped with winches and towing gear, crewed by mechanics who could perform field repairs or tow vehicles to depots. The ratio of wreckers to operational trucks was approximately 1:50, which meant response times could stretch to hours if multiple breakdowns occurred simultaneously. Drivers of deadline trucks were supposed to stay with their vehicles to prevent cargo theft and provide information to recovery crews. In practice, drivers sometimes hitched rides with passing convoys, leaving their trucks unattended. This created security problems and complicated recovery operations when crews arrived to find empty vehicles with no documentation of the failure or driver whereabouts. Fuel consumption for the truck fleet was a logistics problem within a logistics problem. Each deuce-and-a-half consumed approximately 45 liters per 100 kilometers under loaded conditions. A 300-kilometer round trip required 135 liters, nearly filling the 150-liter fuel tank. Trucks refueled at designated points along the routes, typically at depots like Harmon's where fuel pumps could service multiple vehicles simultaneously. Refueling a convoy of 20 trucks required 40 to 60 minutes depending on pump capacity and crew efficiency. That time didn't contribute to tonnage delivery. It was overhead that reduced effective transport capacity. Planners tried to minimize refueling stops by routing convoys through depots with efficient fuel points, but geography and fuel tank capacity imposed constraints. The human dimension of Red Ball operations was as complex as the mechanical and logistical challenges. 23,000 soldiers served as drivers, mechanics, convoy commanders, loaders, and support personnel. Most were young men in their late teens or early 20s, far from home, operating in a war zone. They faced danger from enemy action, occasional strafing by German aircraft, artillery fire when routes passed near front lines, and mines on roads that hadn't been fully cleared. But the more common dangers were accidents, fatigue, and the grinding wear of sustained high-tempo operations. Driver fatigue was the most pervasive problem. Men worked shifts that routinely exceeded 16 hours, driving north with loaded trucks, unloading at forward dumps, driving south empty, refueling, loading again. Sleep came in snatches between runs, often in the cab of their truck or on the ground beside it. Proper rest facilities were rare. There wasn't time or space to establish barracks at every depot. Drivers learned to sleep whenever opportunity allowed, developing the ability to fall asleep instantly and wake fully alert minutes later. But this wasn't real rest. Chronic sleep deprivation accumulated, degrading performance and creating safety risks. Corporal Marcus Webb, the Detroit bus driver Harmon had encountered, exemplified both the resilience and vulnerability of Red Ball drivers. Webb had been driving trucks since the operation began in late August. He'd completed 73 round trips, covering approximately 22,000 kilometers in 3 weeks. His driving record was clean, no accidents, no cargo losses, no disciplinary issues. But he was exhausted in ways that 6-hour rest periods couldn't address. His hands trembled at rest. He had difficulty concentrating when not actively driving. He'd lost 15 pounds because he often forgot to eat. His letters home, which he wrote during loading delays, became increasingly disjointed, jumping between topics without clear transitions. Webb's experience wasn't unique. Medical officers began reporting symptoms they called driver fatigue syndrome, tremors, concentration difficulties, weight loss, irritability, and sleep disturbances, even when time for rest was available. The condition resembled combat fatigue but affected support personnel rather than infantry. Treatment was simple: remove the soldier from operations and provide sustained rest. But the Red Ball couldn't afford to lose drivers, so most continued operating until they either recovered spontaneously, had accidents, or broke down completely. Webb stayed on the routes until September 10th, 3 days after the Red Ball began scaling down. He was evacuated to a field hospital on September 12th with what medical records described as nervous exhaustion. He recovered after 2 weeks of rest and light duty but never returned to driving trucks. The Army reassigned him to a supply depot where his work involved inventory management rather than vehicle operation. Racial tensions within Red Bull units created additional stress for black drivers, who comprised the majority of the driver force. They operated under white officers and frequently encountered discriminatory treatment, slower promotions, harsher discipline for identical infractions, less access to rest facilities and medical care. Some units maintained segregated mess facilities even in field conditions where such separation served no practical purpose except to reinforce racial hierarchy. Black drivers performed the same dangerous work as white drivers, often with older or more poorly maintained equipment, yet received less recognition and fewer opportunities for advancement. These conditions created resentment that occasionally surfaced in disciplinary incidents or reduced morale. But more commonly, black soldiers responded with professionalism and competence, understanding that their performance might influence future opportunities for African Americans in the military. Many viewed their service as contributing not just to Allied victory but to the struggle for civil rights at home. This dual consciousness, serving a nation that denied them full citizenship while hoping that service would demonstrate their worthiness of equal treatment, added psychological complexity to already demanding work. Lieutenant Harmon observed these dynamics and tried to mitigate discrimination within her area of authority. She insisted on equal treatment in her maintenance section. Black and white soldiers performed the same work, received the same evaluations, and had equal access to resources. She recommended black soldiers for promotion and recognition at rates proportional to their numbers and performance. Her approach wasn't universally popular. Some white soldiers and officers objected to what they saw as preferential treatment, though in reality it was simply equal treatment in a system structured around inequality. Harman documented instances of discrimination in her reports, knowing that higher headquarters often ignored such reports, but believing that creating a written record had value even if immediate action wasn't taken. The maintenance challenges Harman's section faced were representative of problems across the Red Bull network. Tire failures were the most frequent issue. High-speed driving on damaged roads generated heat that degraded rubber compounds. The heat buildup was worst in summer temperatures, when ambient air provided minimal cooling. Tires developed cracks in sidewalls, separations between tread and carcass, and catastrophic blowouts that could cause drivers to lose control. Each failure required changing the tire, a 20-minute process under ideal conditions, longer when working roadside without proper equipment. The vulcanizing solution Harman implemented addressed punctures and small separations but couldn't repair catastrophic failures. A tire that had blown out was beyond saving, but tires with punctures from road debris or with minor sidewall separations could be patched and returned to service. The vulcanizing process involved cleaning the damaged area, applying rubber compound, positioning the patch, and then heating it under pressure to create a molecular bond. The equipment, a hand-operated press with heating elements, could process one tire at a time. With two presses operating continuously, Harman's section could vulcanize 12 tires per day. That represented 12 tires kept in service instead of being scrapped, a small but meaningful contribution to maintaining fleet readiness. Engine problems were more complex and time-consuming to repair. The GMC 270 cubic inch inline-six engine was generally reliable but not indestructible. Running at high loads for extended periods caused accelerated wear on pistons, rings, and bearings. Inadequate oil changes, sometimes delayed because units didn't have time or resources to perform them on schedule, accelerated this wear. Engines also suffered from poor quality fuel that sometimes contained water or sediment, causing fuel system problems and cylinder scoring. A thrown rod, the catastrophic failure that had deadlined one of Captain Thompson's trucks, occurred when a connecting rod broke and punched through the engine block. Such failures required complete engine replacement, a job that took two mechanics 6 hours even with proper equipment and parts availability. Transmission problems were common and frustrating. The truck's 5-speed manual transmission was robust but required proper operation. Drivers who didn't double clutch when shifting or who ground gears trying to force shifts damaged synchronizers and gear teeth. The transmission also suffered from inadequate lubrication when seals failed and fluid leaked out. Repairs ranged from simple adjustments to complete transmission replacement. Harman's section could perform minor repairs but had to send trucks requiring major transmission work to depot-level facilities with specialized equipment and trained transmission specialists. Brake systems required constant attention. Drum brakes on all 4 wheels provided stopping power, but brake shoes wore quickly under the loads and speeds of Red Bull operations. Worn shoes reduced braking effectiveness, creating safety hazards. Shoes were supposed to be inspected every 1,000 kilometers and replaced when lining thickness fell below specifications. But inspection schedules often slipped when operational tempo was high and shoes wore to dangerous levels before being replaced. Harman implemented a policy of mandatory brake inspection every time a truck entered her depot, regardless of scheduled maintenance intervals. The policy caught numerous trucks with dangerous brake wear and probably prevented accidents, though the prevented accidents were invisible. No one could count crashes that didn't happen. Parts availability was a perpetual challenge. The Red Bull consumed spare parts faster than the supply system could deliver them. Brake shoes, fan belts, spark plugs, oil filters, fuel filters, gaskets, hoses, and hundreds of other components had to be stocked in quantities sufficient to support 4,000 trucks operating at maximum tempo. The supply system tried to anticipate demand based on historical usage rates, but the Red Bull's operating conditions exceeded historical norms. Parts that normally lasted 5,000 kilometers wore out in 2,000. Components that failed infrequently under normal use failed regularly under Red Bull stress. The result was chronic shortages of critical items. Harman's response was to establish informal supply networks that supplemented official channels. She traded with other units, swapping parts her section had in excess for parts she needed. She scavenged components from deadline trucks that were being sent to depot for major repair, reasoning that if the entire truck was leaving her section anyway, she might as well harvest usable parts from it first. She cultivated relationships with supply sergeants at depots who could sometimes find parts that weren't officially available. These practices were technically violations of supply regulations, which required proper documentation and authorization for all parts transfers. But the regulations had been written for peacetime conditions with adequate supply levels. Combat operations required flexibility and initiative. Harman exercised both, accepting that she might face administrative consequences later in exchange for keeping trucks operational now. The fuel delivery system within the Red Bull network involved multiple layers of transport and distribution. Fuel arrived at Normandy beaches aboard tanker ships, transferred through flexible pipelines to shore-based storage tanks. From storage, fuel moved via pipelines, railroad tank cars, or truck tankers to intermediate depots. At these depots, fuel was pumped into jerry cans or drums for final delivery to forward units. The jerry can system was labor-intensive but flexible. Each can held 5 gallons and could be handled by one person. A truck could carry 200 cans, delivering 1,000 gallons. Handlers at loading points filled cans from pumps or tank trucks, loaded them onto transport trucks, and sent them forward. At receiving points, handlers unloaded cans and either delivered them directly to vehicle fuel tanks or stored them for later use. The drum system offered higher capacity but less flexibility. Each 55-gallon drum held 11 times more fuel than a jerry can but weighed 470 pounds when full, requiring 2 or 3 soldiers to move it safely. Drums were stacked too high in truck beds, delivering approximately 4,000 gallons per truck, 4 times the capacity of a jerry can load. But drums were difficult to pour from and couldn't be carried individually. They were best suited for bulk deliveries to units with pump equipment that could transfer fuel from drums to vehicle tanks efficiently. The choice between jerry cans and drums depended on receiving unit capabilities and immediate tactical needs. Harman's depot maintained a fuel point that could fill trucks from a tank farm supplied by pipeline from coastal storage. The fuel point included 4 pumping stations, each capable of delivering 30 gallons per minute. Filling a truck's 150-litre tank required approximately 12 minutes per pump, including time for the driver to position the vehicle and remove the fuel cap. With 4 pumps operating continuously, the depot could theoretically refuel 20 trucks per hour. Actual throughput was lower due to imperfect scheduling. Sometimes all pumps were busy while trucks queued. Other times pumps sat idle waiting for trucks to arrive. Harman worked to smooth these inefficiencies by coordinating with convoy commanders to stagger arrival times, but perfect scheduling proved impossible given variable driving times and unpredictable delays. The interaction between fuel delivery and fuel consumption created complex feedback loops. Trucks consumed fuel while transporting fuel. A truck driving 300 kilometers consumed 135 liters, but delivered 1,000 gallons in jerry cans, roughly 7 times consumption. System-wide, 4,000 trucks consumed approximately 540,000 liters daily for operations, 142,000 gallons, reducing net cargo capacity by 3.5%. This overhead was unavoidable but required accounting and capacity planning. Food and rations for Red Bull personnel added another logistics layer beyond vehicle maintenance and fuel distribution. 23,000 soldiers required approximately 60,000 meals per day to maintain operational effectiveness. Field kitchens at depots provided hot meals when possible, but drivers often ate K rations or C rations during convoys. These packaged meals provided adequate calories and basic nutrition but were monotonous and sometimes unappetizing after extended consumption. A K ration contained approximately 3,000 calories spread across 3 separate meal units labeled as breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Each unit included canned meat or cheese, crackers or biscuits, fruit bars, instant coffee with sugar packets, and cigarettes for soldier morale. The rations kept indefinitely without refrigeration and could be eaten cold if necessary, making them ideal for soldiers who couldn't access field kitchens regularly. But eating K rations exclusively for weeks at a time in field conditions, as many Red Bull drivers did, led to widespread complaints about taste and texture monotony. Soldiers craved fresh vegetables, bread, and anything that didn't come directly from a can. Medical support was limited but essential. Each major depot had an aid station staffed by medics treating minor injuries, cuts, burns, sprains, infections, common ailments. Serious conditions required evacuation to field hospitals. Disease was an ongoing concern, particularly gastrointestinal infections from contaminated water or food. Dysentery spread through units periodically, temporarily reducing manpower. An outbreak at Harmon's depot in early September affected 14 soldiers, reducing maintenance capacity by 30% until recovery. Combat casualties were rare but not non-existent. German aircraft occasionally strafed convoys. Artillery struck vehicles near combat zones. Mines destroyed trucks and killed drivers. The casualty figures, 32 killed, 300 wounded, represented 1% of the workforce. But each casualty meant someone performing essential work couldn't. Replacing trained personnel took time, reducing system capacity. The psychological toll affected everyone. Harmon made decisions while exhausted, operating on 4 hours of sleep nightly, skipping meals. She developed stress headaches, shortened temper, lost perspective. She recognized stress responses but couldn't reduce workload. The operation demanded constant attention. The September wind-down of Red Bull operations brought mixed emotions, relief that the impossible pace would end, but also pride in what had been accomplished. Harmon's section had supported over 7,000 truck passages, maintained an 84% operational rate, and contributed to delivering more than 30,000 tons of supplies through their stretch of the network. Those numbers translated to ammunition that reached artillery batteries, fuel that kept tanks advancing, rations that fed soldiers at the front. The logistical contribution enabled tactical and operational successes that received more attention and recognition, but the connection was direct without the logistics. The combat victories wouldn't have happened. The Army conducted after-action reviews throughout fall 1944. Harmon submitted a detailed report documenting procedures, innovations, challenges, and recommendations. She emphasized preventive maintenance as key to high operational rates. She documented vulcanizing and recommended adoption as standard practice. She provided data on failure rates under Red Bull conditions, noting official maintenance intervals were too long for high-stress operations. She recommended reduced intervals, oil changes every 800 kilometers instead of 1,600, tire inspections twice daily, brake inspections every 500 kilometers. Some recommendations were implemented quickly. Tire vulcanizing became standard within months. Others took years through bureaucratic doctrine revision. Some were never implemented due to conflicting procedures or institutional resistance. The post-war assessment emphasized the Red Bull's success in sustaining Third Army's advance. Historical analyses credited the operation with enabling the liberation of Paris, the pursuit to the German border, and positioning for the final push into Germany. These achievements came at a cost in vehicle wear, soldier exhaustion, and accidents, but the cost was judged acceptable given strategic results. Harmon's contribution was one of thousands that made the Red Bull function. She managed a small section, solving local problems that aggregated into system success. Her innovations, tire vulcanizing, enhanced preventive maintenance, informal parts networks were representative of countless similar innovations across the network. The Red Bull worked because people like Harman saw problems, developed solutions, and implemented them without waiting for permission. That pragmatic approach, multiplied across the entire operation, transformed desperate improvisation into a functioning system achieving its objectives. In post-war years, teaching logistics courses and consulting for civilian companies, Harman often returned to Red Bull examples. The operation demonstrated that complex systems succeeded or failed based on countless small decisions executed competently. Technology and doctrine mattered, but weren't sufficient. Success required people who understood their jobs, took initiative when needed, and maintained standards under pressure. Those human factors determined outcomes as much as material resources. The Red Bull Express operated 81 days, moved 400,000 tons, employed thousands of soldiers, consumed millions of gallons of fuel, wore out tens of thousands of tires, and enabled Third Army's advance across France. It was simultaneously impressive logistics achievement and desperate improvisation barely keeping pace with demands. It succeeded because competent people worked very hard under difficult conditions and refused to accept failure. Lieutenant Ellen Harman was one of those people, managing a maintenance section that processed 7,000 trucks and kept operational rates high through preventive maintenance and practical problem-solving. Her contribution was modest in scope, but representative of the competence that made the entire system function. The Red Bull worked because many people like Harman did their jobs well. That's how logistics succeeds, not through dramatic gestures but through consistent competence applied daily across thousands of small decisions. The Red Bull also demonstrated the importance of measuring performance and learning from data. Harman's meticulous record-keeping enabled her to identify patterns, anticipate problems, and implement preventive measures. Organizations that measured performance could improve it. Organizations that didn't measure operated blind. This principle applied whether the organization was military or civilian, managing trucks across France or commercial supply chains. Measurement, analysis, and continuous improvement were universal. The final lesson concerned leadership under stress. Effective leaders balanced competing demands, maintaining current operations while planning for future needs, meeting expectations while advocating for subordinates, following doctrine while improvising when needed. That balance required judgment developed through experience. It required understanding that perfect solutions rarely existed, and that good enough solutions implemented quickly often produced better results than perfect solutions implemented slowly. These lessons shaped Harman's approach throughout her subsequent career. She led by example, demonstrating competence and commitment while maintaining realistic expectations. She delegated authority, trusting subordinates to solve problems within their areas. She advocated upward for resources and reasonable workloads. She maintained standards even when pressure mounted, understanding that cutting corners created future problems exceeding any short-term gains. The Red Bull Express operated for 81 days, moved more than 400,000 tons of supplies, employed thousands of soldiers, consumed millions of gallons of fuel, wore out tens of thousands of tires, and enabled Third Army's advance across France. It was simultaneously an impressive logistics achievement and a desperate improvisation that barely kept pace with operational demands. It succeeded because competent people worked very hard under difficult conditions and refused to accept failure. Lieutenant Ellen Harman was one of those people, managing a maintenance section that processed 7,000 trucks and kept operational rates high through preventive maintenance and practical problem-solving. Her contribution was modest in scope, but representative of the competence that made the entire system function. The Red Bull worked because many people like Harman did their jobs well. That's how logistics succeeds, not through dramatic gestures but through consistent competence applied daily across thousands of small decisions.